way to the promise to Abraham that all nations would be blessed through the Israelite people. This is a foreign woman who is being blessed through the Israelite people. We also have the note in when Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt during the Exodus event, and it tells us that there was a rabble of people with them. You know, there was this other group of people that were not Israelites who left with them, who went with them. And Rahab here is being added to that rabble, that mixed multitude of people that are going with the Israelites. I mentioned last week that Rahab, was kind of singled out for this special treatment. And in the story, for the author of Joshua, what he wants us to understand, again, is that Rahab represents Canaan. She is the quintessential Canaanite. She is the quintessential foreigner. She is everything that is other from an Israelite person. So not only is she not an Israelite by ethnicity, by birth, any of that, but she is the lowest of the Canaanites. The fact that she is a harlot, a prostitute, makes her the lowest of the low in their society. And so this has been for us to understand, and we talked last week about how the author kept elevating her throughout the story, kept elevating her position in the words she used. She looked out through the window, that this picture is portraying. And that phrase is only used by high society women in the Bible. The phrase that she uses, the God above and on earth below, is only used by Moses and Solomon, other than Rahab. So the author keeps elevating her position, wanting us to understand that as somebody who's the lowest of the low, God can raise you up. And so it's going to be a reminder for the Israelite people, as they are about to go through a period of time, like hundreds of years, where over and over they are in positions of being the lowest of the low. Lowest of low for them being out of relationship with God, out of relationship with their God. But the reminder is they can be brought back to right relationship. They can be elevated just like Rahab was, just like this prostitute was. Indeed, in Judges, we're going to see at the beginning, it says that the Israelites prostituted themselves to the foreign gods and goddesses, to the Canaanite gods and goddesses. Moses, in his farewell address, warns them, do not prostitute yourselves to these idols. The same word that's used to describe Rahab. That word zona, so the connection there is made as well. So the greatest possible threat to the Israelite people in the promised land, in the land of Canaan, is idol worship, is playing the harlot, prostituting themselves to these foreign gods and goddesses. So this is, again, part of her story is setting up the continuing story of the Israelite people. So they move from there, Jericho there, kind of in the just right of the middle. Then you can follow kind of one of those green lines, the solid green line up to Bethel and Ai. The dotted green line we'll talk about in a minute. That's the line of ambush that the Israelites took the second time they tried to fight against Ai. But so they are going to travel up. You can tell a little bit from this map, but they're traveling up into the hills. Up into the mountains. So again, you have the Jordan River there on the right. That is the valley of the Jordan River as it is still to this day. The plains of Moab, the plains of the Jordan. Jericho exists down, way below sea level at that point, in these plains, in this valley. So they travel up the hills to Ai. If you have been to Israel with me, you have traveled this direction. You can kind of see maybe from like you probably can't make it out on the screen up there. If you look at the slides later, like on the far left of the picture, right in the middle, there's a kind of, you can see the road coming in from the far left of the picture. And that road that travels there, that's the road that we travel when we leave Jerusalem and are going up to Galilee for our second week. We travel on that road between Bethel and Ai. So at the beginning of chapter 7 of Joshua, after the conquering of Jericho, it says the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Achan, son of Carmi, the son of Zimri, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah, took some of them. So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. What it's describing here is the devoted things. The devoted things were the jewels, the gold, the precious metals, that kind of stuff that was supposed to be devoted completely to God from Jericho. They weren't supposed to keep any of it. Now, what that stuff would have gone to is the sanctuary. And so by Achan taking some of this stuff that was supposed to go to the sanctuary of the Lord, he's basically stealing directly from God. And so that's the picture we're told here. That what's interesting to look at the first part, though, the Israelites were unfaithful in regard to the devoted things. Well, really, in the end, it's just one dude that is unfaithful. But this is this idea of corporate responsibility, that the Israel is in this all together. There's no just this guy sinned, so he's punished. They are all under the covenant of God. So when one of them breaks something under the covenant of God, they are all responsible for it. So they all have responsibility for Achan's sin here. Did I forget to put verse 2 in here? I think I forgot to put verse 2. I'll read it. So Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, to the east of Bethel, and told them, go up and spy out the region. So the men went up and spied out Ai. So again, we have spies being sent out. So we see that under the leadership of Moses. Soon after the Exodus event, soon after they leave Mount Sinai, he sends the 12 spies, one from each tribe, into the promised land. They come back. Joshua and Caleb said, God can deliver the promised land to us. It's just like he said. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. The other 10 guys are terrified. They say we shouldn't go. So because of their lack of faith, they wander in the desert for 40 years. Then we have Joshua sending the 2 spies into Jericho. Now again, we have Joshua sending 2 spies into the city of Ai here. So now pick up at verse 3 here. When they returned to Joshua, they said, not all the army will have to go up against Ai. Send 2,000 or 3,000 men to take it, and do not weary the whole army, for only a few people live there. So about 3,000 went up, but they were routed by the men of Ai, who killed about 36 of them. That doesn't really sound like much of a rout, but we'll get back to the numbers in a minute here. So they killed about 36 of the Israelites. They, meaning the people of Ai, chased the Israelites from the city gate as far as the stone quarries and struck them down on the slopes. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. So the Israelites are, as it says, routed by the people of Ai. Now notice that in this instance, the people of Israel are doing this on their own. They're saying, like, the spies come back and they say, oh, piece of cake. We don't got to worry about making a plan. We don't need to worry about consulting with God. It's going to be a piece of cake to take Ai. Just send 2,000 or 3,000. They send 3,000, and they're summarily routed by the people of Ai, and sent running back to their camp, back down near Jericho. And so it's interesting that the word that it uses there, too, of that they melted. Remember, that's exactly what Rahab had told to the 2 spies sent by Joshua to her, or into Jericho, that the people here are melting with fear. And now it's said of the Israelite people. At this, the hearts of the people melted in fear and became like water. Joshua tore his clothes and fell face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord, remaining there till evening. The elders of the Israel did the same and sprinkled dust on their heads. And Joshua said, alas, sovereign Lord, why did you ever bring the people across the Jordan to deliver us into the hands of the Amorites to destroy us? If only we had been content to stay on the other side of the Jordan. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? His talk there sounds a lot like the people wandering in when they leave Egypt and the Egyptians are pursuing them. Pharaoh's army is pursuing them. And they're saying, oh, we should have just stayed there. And then when they're wandering in the desert, we should have just stayed in Egypt. We've been better off staying there. Joshua's like, man, if only we had just been happy to be on the other side of the Jordan and never crossed over. But then, it's sort of like the Psalms where you have a psalmist voicing this displeasure, this discontent with God, but then kind of circling back around at the end and saying, but I trust you. And Joshua kind of does the same. Pardon your servant, Lord. What can I say now that Israel has been routed by its enemies? So the Canaanites and the other people of the country will hear about this, and they will surround us and wipe out our name from the earth. What then will you do for your own great name? And the Lord replied to Joshua, stand up. What are you doing down on your face? Israel has sinned. They have violated my covenant, which I commanded them to keep. They have taken some of the devoted things. They have stolen. They have lied. They have put them with their own possessions. That is why the Israelites cannot stand against their enemies. They turn their backs and run because they have been made liable to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy whatever among you is devoted to destruction. Go, consecrate the people. Tell them, consecrate yourselves in preparation for tomorrow. This is what the Lord God of Israel says. There are devoted things among you. You cannot stand against your enemies until you remove them. So what happens next, I'll just summarize this part. We're not going to read through it, but Joshua calls all the tribes before him, and they start whittling it down. Okay, this tribe come forward, the tribe of Judah. Okay, this family from the tribe of Judah come forward. Okay, this smaller family of that family from the tribe of Judah come forward. And they finally get it down to this guy Achan. And they realize that he's the one who has committed this sin, this crime, this breaking of the covenant. And Joshua says to Achan, my son, give glory to the Lord, the God of Israel, and honor him. Tell me what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Achan replied, it's true. I have sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. This is what I have done. When I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. They are hidden in the ground inside my tent with the silver underneath. So what he takes here, these precious metals, this robe, the amount of money that represents is more than the average worker would earn in their entire lifetime. So it's not a small thing that he took. It's not like he just slipped in a nice little golden earring in his pocket or something here. This represents a lot of money that Achan has stolen. And again, the crime is against what was devoted to God. These things are supposed to go into the sanctuary of the Lord. So it's kind of this direct stealing against God that Achan has committed this crime or this sin. So Joshua sent messengers, and they ran to the tent, and there it was, hidden in his tent with the silver underneath. They took the things from the tent, brought them to Joshua, and all the Israelites spread them out before the Lord. Then Joshua, together with all Israel, took Achan, son of Zerah, the silver, the robe, the gold bar, and his sons and daughters, his cattle, his donkeys, his sheep, his tent, and all that he had to the valley of Achor. Joshua said, why have you brought this trouble on us? The Lord will bring trouble on you today. Then all Israel stoned him, and after they had stoned the rest, they burned them. Over Achan they heaped a large pile of rocks, which remains to this day. Then the Lord turned from his fierce anger. Therefore that place has been called the Valley of Achor ever since. Valley of Achor translates something like Valley of Trouble, and you can kind of see that in there, like, you've brought trouble upon us. And so this stoning, you know, it says all Israel came. We don't know if every single person took part in this. It probably is unlikely, but probably a representative from each tribe or multiple from each tribe. The picture would be that everybody is responsible to carry out this execution. In stonings like that, you had multiple. It's kind of like if you think about in our capital punishment, like if you're before a firing squad, you know, it's like if there's 12 shooters, 6 of them have a bullet and 6 of them have a blank, and you don't know who actually fired a real bullet and who fired a blank. Same thing for, like, you know, the why am I blanking on the name? The lethal injection. You know, there's the different buttons, and supposedly, you know, they push these buttons. You don't know who pushed the button that actually distributed the lethal dose to that person, so that somebody mentally doesn't have that in their head that they are the ones who carried out the execution. It's similar to this, that everybody is taking part in this stoning, for that kind of purpose, so that nobody has the guilt upon their own head, but 2, to carry it out as a community. The violation that Achan committed was a violation directly against God, but it affected the entire community. So the entire community here carries out this execution of not just Achan, but his entire family. Now in Deuteronomy, we actually have a verse that talks about children not being responsible for the sins of their parents. So, you know, often we've looked at this about why in the world are these children being held responsible for Achan's sin? The difference is in the Deuteronomy verse, when it talks about a child not being held responsible for their parents' sin, the people that are sitting in judgment of that person are their fellow Israelite people. The difference here is that God is sitting as the judge. So it's only God that can carry out, this obliteration, I guess, of an entire family or family line here. So that's the difference between that idea that a child shouldn't be held responsible for their parents. But again, keep this in mind. We're going to circle back to all these ideas of these annihilations, these obliterations of people here. Before we begin chapter 8, continuing the story of Ai, any questions or comments? It's awful, yeah. That's a running theme probably through some of our stories tonight. And again, I don't think I mentioned this before. I mean, you probably know by now I stop periodically to ask for questions or comments. But if you've got them as we're going along, just shoot your hand up or say my name and how do they know what? Well, the question is, how do they know that it's God who told them to destroy these people? For them, it would be coming from Joshua as their leader. So Joshua seems to be the one with the relationship to God in this regard. So the people are following Joshua's leadership and trusting his relationship with God. Well, that's a good question. How does Joshua know? We're never told exactly, what kind of relationship Joshua had with God. Moses is distinguished, as is like Abraham, as somebody who, walks with God, has like a face-to-face relationship with God. It seems that Joshua has a different type of relationship with God than Moses would have. So we don't know exactly what kind of, was it auditory? Like, could he literally hear the voice of God? Like if you had the little recording app on your phone, if Joshua had one then, could he have recorded God's voice? We don't know if that's the kind of, thing that it would have taken place, or if it's, through prayer, it's through his own discernment and judgment. We're not really told. We are told by the author wouldn't be very concerned with how the communication happened from God to Joshua. The author is only concerned with the fact that we should trust Joshua. And that seems certain for the author's perspective, that Joshua is somebody to be trusted and his relationship with God should be trusted. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. She said it's the same thing as when somebody says, like, the devil made me do it, but she would like to hear an actual voice. I think certainly we all would love that kind of confirmation. Yeah, Larry? Yeah, his point is, who's Achan going to sell these to? Like, where's the black market that he's going to be able to go? Where's the nearest pawn shop he's going to be able to run to get rid of these things and get the money for it? Yeah, it's a good point. I suppose that he would have thought that he might have been able to trade with the Canaanites, the people group, might be adding to his very sin there, that the idea that he would trade with the Canaanite people certainly would have been under the ban. Does somebody have their hand raised by him? Yeah, she said the confirmation would be the success that they have afterwards. And certainly that, I guess in some ways we might think of that as like confirmation bias, but it's very true. The point you're making, the fact that there is success, it shows that Joshua is in right relationship with God and following what God would have him do. Yeah. Yeah, the question is, why would God have Achan's entire family wiped out? I don't know that there's a good answer for that, other than there's again a corporate idea of sin and redemption and covenant that is part of the Israelite people and their relationship with God that I think is hard sometimes for us to understand as Christians, because our idea of relationship with God and sin and atonement and redemption and repentance is so singular and individual and personal that we often, think of my sin. It's my sin. It's my responsibility to repent for my sin. So I'm not responsible for somebody else's sin. Their repentance doesn't count for me. I have to repent. We think in those terms. For the Israelite people, the idea of being a community under covenant is central to their entire survival and success and relationship with God. So many of the 10 commandments that we have are really about the preservation of the community. And among that, what's called it translates to basically the father's family. These individual families that make up the community. And you see it in kind of the breakdown from Joshua coming up and saying, okay, all the tribes line up. Okay, tribe of Judah, come forward. Okay, just this family, this big family, extended family from the tribe of Judah, you come forward. Just this family from that extended family from the tribe of Judah, you come forward. And it gets down to Achan. Well, then the reverse becomes true, where it kind of goes back up to his family. He is responsible as the father for his entire family. And so the destruction that needs to come on Achan comes upon his entire family. Any other question or comment? Yeah. The silver being underneath the gold? I think it's underneath the robe. Did I read that right? I don't know. Not that I've ever seen somebody talk about. It's a good question, or interesting question, the idea. Yeah. Yeah, you're right. It's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that before, whether there's significance to that. I haven't ever seen somebody talk about whether there's significance to it, but yeah. He was asking about if there was any significance to how he hid the devoted items that he had stolen. But I don't know. I'll have to look into that and see. Yeah, won't be? Her point isn't in the end God knows what he's doing, and things we don't know. Yeah, we'll get back to that a little bit later. This kind of what you're describing is kind of what the book of Job kind of conclusion is. Basically, God's God and you're not. It's kind of the conclusion of the book of Job, and to put it succinctly. And there's obviously some truth to that. We know that to be true. God's God and I'm not. God's God and you're not. God's God and we're not. But sometimes that doesn't. It's not always a satisfactory answer, I think. Yeah. Under the law, yeah, under the covenant. They're all responsible under the covenant. And so because they're all part of Achan's household, and again, the idea of the father's family being so central to the entire Israelite community, it leads to their corporate responsibility under Achan's sin. Okay. Chapter 8, the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Take the whole army with you and go up and attack Ai. So now the battle plan's coming from God. The first time they go and attack Ai, when they are routed, when they fail, it's the spies coming back and saying, this is going to be a piece of cake. Just send a few thousand of us. It'll be easy. So the battle plan comes from them. Now the battle plan comes from God. For I have delivered into your hands the king of Ai, his people, his city, and his land. You shall do to Ai and its king as you did to Jericho and its king, except that you may carry off their plunder and livestock for yourselves. Set an ambush behind the city. It's got to be like, oh man, Achan, if only he had waited till after the Ai, he could have had some of the plunder this time. But so there's going to be a difference now between the conquering of Ai and the conquering of Jericho, where the devoted things were going to be set aside for the sanctuary of the Lord, but this time they're allowed to take some of the plunder. Here's the plan, though, to set an ambush. Again, you can kind of see the road now right there in the middle, kind of going up the side of that hill. That's the road that we take when we travel through Israel. So it's kind of between Ai here. This is showing where the Israelites would have hidden. They come up from the region of Jericho, and a bunch of them are hiding in this area where they can't be seen, setting the ambush. So basically what they do is come up. This is kind of facing south. So they're coming up where it shows where the ambush force hid over there on the far right. That's actually to the west of Ai there, that's over on the left. The reason that's important is because the people, the rest of the Israelites are going to be coming from the east, coming from Jericho. So they're going to be coming from this direction over here. Meanwhile, the ambush is set on the other side. So the people of Ai are going to be looking towards the east for the Israelites coming up, and not looking or not expecting the ambush from the other side. We're going to run out of time, so we're not going to read all this. Basically, they set the ambush here. They lay in wait. Early the next morning, Joshua mustered his army, and he and the leaders of Israel marched before them to Ai. The entire force that was with him marched up and approached the city and arrived in front of it. They set up a camp north of Ai with the valley between them and the city. Joshua had taken about 5,000 men and set them in ambush between Bethel and Ai to the west of the city. So the soldiers took up their positions with the main camp to the north of the city and the ambush to the west of it. That night Joshua went into the valley. So again, the king of Ai here, the leader there, he is not expecting this. He is expecting that the Israelites, the little bit of the army, the little bit of the Israelites that they routed, have gone back and gotten reinforcements. They are expecting this large army to be coming up from the east, and they are not looking to the west to and anticipating this ambush. So the ambush works here. Verse 16, all the men of Ai were called to pursue them, and they pursued Joshua and were lured away from the city. Not a man remained in Ai or Bethel who did not go after Israel. They all left the city open and went in pursuit of Israel. Then the Lord said to Joshua, hold out toward Ai the javelin that is in your hand, for into your hand I will deliver the city. So Joshua held out toward the city the javelin that was in his hand. And as soon as he did this, the men in the ambush rose quickly from their position and rushed forward. They entered the city and captured it and quickly set it on fire. So here's Joshua holding out the javelin as the signal. The ambush comes and it works. They rout the people of Ai. Verse 24, when Israel had finished killing all the men of Ai in the fields and in the wilderness where they had chased them, and when every one of them had been put to the sword, all the Israelites returned to Ai and killed those who were in it. 12,000 men and women fell that day, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not draw back the hand that held out his javelin until he had destroyed all who lived in Ai. But Israel did carry off for themselves the livestock and the plunder of the city as the Lord had instructed Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a permanent heap of ruins, a desolate place to this day. He impaled the body of the king of Ai on a pole and left it there until evening. At sunset, Joshua ordered them to take the body from the pole and throw it down at the entrance of the city gate, and they raised a large pile of rocks over it, which remains to this day. So the ambush works. They totally destroy Ai in the same way that they had destroyed Jericho. And I want to stop for a minute here and just mention there's throughout this story there's a parallel between Rahab and Achan. We come back again to Rahab's story because Achan's story is tied to hers. First of all, it's the only 2 times that Joshua sends out spies. He sends out spies to Jericho, and they encounter Rahab. He sends out spies to Ai before they are routed, and then they discover Achan's sin, and then they go and, under God's battle plan with the ambush, they take Ai. But for Rahab, she's not just the first Canaanite that the Israelites encounter when they're coming into the land of Canaan, to the promised land. But again, like I mentioned last week, she's the quintessential Canaanite. She's the lowest of the low. She represents everything that is other than from the Israelite people. Whereas Achan isn't Israelite. So whereas Rahab's the lowest of the low and is elevated by God into the under his covenant with the Israelites, Achan is an Israelite and is basically annihilated away from that covenant because of what he did. It's interesting, too, that the author chooses to say about both of them, to this day. So he says, to this day, Rahab is a part of the family of Israel. And to this day, Achan's sin is remembered by the people of Israel. So the author is drawing a direct comparison there between Rahab and Achan. And again, the picture for the Israelite people, as the readers and listeners of this story of Joshua, is to understand it both ways. If I'm in a low position, if I'm out of right relationship with God, I can be reinstated to that, into relationship with God. And it's true the other way. If I am in relationship with God, but I choose to do things against the covenant, you can fall out of that. And so the reminder is there for the people of Israel, because once again, we are about to get to a time where they're going to harlot themselves to the gods and goddesses of the Canaanite people. And so the author here in Joshua is making the picture clear of Rahab and Achan and how they compare and contrast. So the difference, the difference between Israelite and a Canaanite is not just ethnic, like something you're born, the people group. It's a religious thing, because Rahab is put into that people group. She is not Israelite by birth, but she becomes part of the Israelite family through her relationship not only with God, but with the fellow people of Israel. So they go from here to Mount Ebal. We've been here before with Abraham and Jacob. If you've been to Israel, you've been here as well. Or if you went to Israel with me, you've been here. Up on the left there is Mount Gerizim. Over on the far left is Mount Ebal. In the middle is the city of Shechem. Today that's called Nablus. In the Bible it's called either Shechem, or in the New Testament it's called Sychar, where Jesus meets the Samaritan woman at the well. So again, Mount Gerizim there on the far left. The mountain of blessings. Mount Ebal, the mountain of curses. Mount Gerizim is where we've gone. That's where I mentioned last week, I think, that half the Samaritan population that still exists in the world lives up at the top of Mount Gerizim. You can kind of see there, I don't know, you probably can't read it, but ruins of the Samaritan temple up there on Mount Gerizim, and again, Shechem in the middle between Gerizim and Ebal. Joshua builds this altar. Here's kind of a recreation of that. You can actually visit it still to this day. Here's what that looks like. There's actually a couple possible locations for that. One of them is right in the middle of the city. You can kind of see there. It's just all these surrounding apartment buildings and stuff. And then right in the middle is what is thought to be maybe the remaining altar that Joshua built here in this story to renew the covenant, the covenant with God. So there in the presence of the Israelites, Joshua wrote on the stones a copy of the law of Moses. Verse 34, afterward Joshua read all the words of the law, the blessings and the curses, just as is written in the book of the law. There was not a word of all that Moses had commanded that Joshua did not read to the whole assembly of Israel, including the women and children and the foreigners who lived among them. So here's kind of a picture of him reading those. There seems to be some significance to where he was when he did this, that this kind of idea of a natural amphitheater, that people could hear him reading out the laws of Moses. Again, a reminder of what is expected of them. I mentioned last week that this is what the great difference is between the Israelite people and the Canaanite people, the Amorite people, the Perizzite people, the Hivite people, all the peoples of the living in the promised land at this time. The biggest difference is that the Israelites know what God expects of them. And if they sin and they fall out of relationship with God, they know what God wants them to do to get back into relationship with him. This is completely different than all the other people groups in the area where they had no idea what made their gods and goddesses angry or happy. And if they're angry with them, how to make them happy again. So again, that's what in week 1 we talked about the Psalm 19, that the law is sweeter than honey. It is your very life. So again, Joshua is reading these out in this renewal of the covenant to show them again, this is why our God is different. This is why we're following the God of our people, because he tells us what he expects of us and how to be in relationship with him. We're going to see in a few minutes that again, this idea of being at Shechem, we first see this in Genesis chapter 12, and the promise is made, this covenant promise is made to Abraham. We see it here in Joshua chapter 8 at the renewal, and then we'll see it in a few minutes in Joshua chapter 24, probably a verse that a lot of you know, that as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. There again, back at Shechem, that is Joshua's farewell address. So we'll come back to that in a minute. A couple things here. We're not going to read through these because we don't have time, so I'll just kind of tell you what's happening here. There is a people group called the Gibeonites. They are from, if you've been to Israel, you know that when we left Jerusalem and went to the place called Nebi Samuel, the tomb of the prophet Samuel, we stood there and looked out over the area of Benjamin from the 12 tribes, them dividing up the land. That is Gibeon. So there's a people from there. What they do is they come up with this plan. Okay, we see that Joshua has destroyed Jericho. We see that Joshua has annihilated Ai and Bethel. So what are we going to do? We know that he's coming for us. We know they're taking no prisoners at this point. So what are our options here? They don't seem to be willing to make some kind of treaty with people that live in this land. So what they do is they tatter their clothes. They make all their clothes look tattered. They get bread that's been out for a long time so that's moldy and stuff like that. And they go to Joshua, and they're like, we're not from around here. We're from a foreign land as well, but we heard that what your God is doing in this land. Look at our bread, how moldy it is. It was great when we left our home. And look at our clothes. These were brand new when we left our home, but look at them now. You know, we're from far away. And Joshua was like, are you sure you don't live around here? They're like, well, sure, we don't live around here. So make a treaty with us. We'll join you, and we'll join your whole journey and escapade here. And Joshua falls for it. He does it. He makes a treaty with them and finds out later that they have tricked him. But Joshua doesn't go back on his oath. He keeps the promise that he's made to them in this treaty that he's made, and they are allowed to continue living in that land. It doesn't take them too long to realize when they don't go very far, and they're like, wait, you just went inside that house. What, well, yeah, I thought you didn't live around here. They're like, sorry, gotcha. But again, Joshua doesn't go back on his oath, doesn't go back on his word, and allows them to live. Now, there's a people group that he does not allow to live, and that is in let's go to the next one here. Battle of the Five Kings. This is in Joshua chapter 10. There's these kings that hear about what has happened, and they say, every single one of our cities is going to fall if we just wait for Joshua to come conquer us. So what we need to do is band together and go and fight him. And so they do this. They are routed. God sends hailstones upon them. You can kind of see in that picture on the right there. This is in Joshua chapter 10, verses 11. As they fled before Israel on the road, the Lord hurled large hailstones down on them, and more of them died from the hail than were killed by the swords of the Israelites. Verse 12, on the day the Lord gave, this is always kind of a weird story. On the day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel, Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, sun, stand over Gibeon, and you, moon, over the valley of Ayalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jashar. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. Surely the Lord was fighting for Israel. Then Joshua returned with all Israel to the camp at Gilgal. So here's this picture on the left there of, Joshua telling the sun to stand still. This is not, if you've been to Israel, when we left Jerusalem and go down to Emmaus, that's right on the border of the valley of Ayalon. So we kind of looked out over that valley and talked briefly about this story that took place in that area. But what's unique is it says the sun stood still for like about a day. The moon's doing something on its own too, standing still or stopping. We don't know exactly what to make of this story. It sounds like some sort of cosmological event that's happening here. For the people at this time, they judged the months based on the moon, and then they corrected throughout the year with the calendar following the sun to kind of get back on track. So it's kind of this constant back and forth. And they were always trying to get the moon to be fullest, like on the 14th of their month. There's this whole process of that they were using to gauge time. The reason that's important is because the sun and the moon standing still here is going to affect that. Now, we usually look at the story and think of it as an actual cosmological event, and there's nothing wrong with that. Could God make the sun stand still for 24 hours and the moon stand still for 24 hours? Sure. But look at what it actually says. There has never been a day like it before or since. And you've got to think, well, yeah, that sounds about right. I've never heard of the sun just standing still for 24 hours or the moon stopping for 24 hours, so that makes sense. But that's not what the author says is unique about this day. It's not that the sun stood still. It's not that the moon stopped. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a human being. So the significance for the author is God's relationship with Joshua, that God, the people of Israel under his leadership here. So again, we don't always know exactly what to make of that story, but for the author of Joshua, the significance of the story is God's relationship with Joshua in this event. Now, the 5 kings of those cities, when their people are being chased and slaughtered, they go and they hide in this cave. The Israelites find them very quickly. It doesn't take them long. They come here. They put their feet upon their necks, we're told. And then the 5 kings are slaughtered as well. And just like let's see, where'd it go? When they brought these kings, this is Joshua chapter 10, verse 24. When they had brought these kings to Joshua, he summoned all the men of Israel and said to the army commanders who had come with him, "Come here and put your feet on the necks of these kings." So they came forward and placed their feet on their necks. Joshua said to them, "Do not be afraid, do not be discouraged. Be strong and courageous. This is what the Lord will do to all the enemies you are going to fight." Then Joshua put the kings to death and exposed their bodies on 5 poles, and they were left hanging on the poles until evening. So the whole hanging on the poles thing obviously is after execution. That's not the form of execution. That's displaying them after execution. We see it actually later with King Saul. Again, if you've been to Israel, you've been to Beit Shan, you know that at that site is where they hung Saul and his sons from the city walls, displaying them as well. And at sunset, Joshua gave the order, and they took them down from the poles and threw them into the cave where they had been hiding. At the mouth of the cave, they placed rocks, which are there to this day. So what we have following this is, in the rest of chapter 24, is all about, if you look in your Bible, you've probably got something in there, like some heading, verse 28, that says, "Southern cities conquered." So we talked before about how Joshua is leading. This is a military strategy. You're coming up through the back door. You came around the eastern side of the Dead Sea. You come in the back door, across the Jordan River to where Jericho is. You go up to where Bethel and Ai are, and that's the Benjamin Plateau. That is a high point in the land. From there, you go north and south, and you can go west as well, although there's not much west to go at that point till you get to the Mediterranean Sea. But from there, you're splitting the country like in two by going north and south. So that's the story we have here. The southern cities are conquered and destroyed. And then in chapter 11, we have the northern kings are defeated. We're going to pick up there and talk about one city in particular. Are there any questions or comments? What's that? What's peaceful? Oh, okay. She's saying it facetiously. It's very peaceful. Clearly the book of Joshua here is, pretty bloody. And that continues. There's one city here in particular. Let's see, let's go to the next one. At that time, Joshua turned back and captured Hazor and put its king to the sword. Hazor had been the head of all these kingdoms. So particularly up in the north of the promised land, Hazor was the greatest of all the cities. It was the head of all these kingdoms. So the fact that Joshua is leading them to conquer Hazor is a significant military event and strategy here. Everyone in it they put to the sword. They totally destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. And he burned Hazor itself. The Israelites carried off for themselves all the plunder and livestock of these cities, but all the people they put to the sword until they completely destroyed them, not sparing anyone that breathed. So here's Hazor as it is today. Again, if you've been to Israel with me, you've been here. This is kind of probably a drone that's above the parking lot looking towards remains from the city of Hazor. Not everything has been uncovered, but a lot has. To the right down there that's kind of off the screen would have been the whole lower part of the city. That would have been in existence at the time of Joshua, but when they destroy the entire city of Hazor here, that lower city is never resettled. Here's kind of a closer look. You can kind of see on the right-hand side there's some cars and stuff. It might give you a little perspective on scale of what you're looking at here. Under that red roof, we're going to have some other pictures in a second, but under that red roof area is actually the remains of the Canaanite palace from the time of Joshua. What you're looking at down there, kind of at the bottom, here's a closer look. This was a gate to the city that's later built by Solomon. So a few hundred years later, Solomon rebuilds the city of Hazor, but it had been destroyed under Joshua a few hundred years before. Here's kind of the entrance to that. You can walk through the gate that Solomon built over towards the Canaanite palace. Here's the Canaanite palace as it is today, kind of the remains there. Here's kind of a recreation, I guess, there of what they think it would have looked like. But it's a significant event here to be able to go to Hazor and sit in the Canaanite palace that was essentially destroyed by Joshua. Of all the cities, places, sites mentioned in the book of Joshua that are destroyed under his leadership, Hazor is the most important one. To this day, it's UNESCO, United Nations World Heritage Site, along with Beersheba in the south, Megiddo in the Valley of Jezreel, and then here at Hazor. There's 3 of them in modern-day Israel that you can visit that are significant places in the history of civilization. That's why they're marked that way by the United Nations. But we have extensive archaeological digs and finds at Hazor showing that the city was indeed burned to the ground in the Bronze Age. Now, the Bronze Age is the time period that we're talking about under Joshua. When you get to Saul and David, that starts a time period called the Iron Age. We're in the Bronze Age. We don't know exactly the date that the city would have been burned, but we know that the city was burned to the ground in the Bronze Age. What that brings up is the Bible right about who destroyed Hazor? Because this is an ongoing question. We can see archaeologically that the city was indeed destroyed, but is the Bible right? We know the story that we have in Joshua here in the Bible. Some other possible candidates, I guess, that could have destroyed it that people have offered is the Babylonians. At this point, the Babylonians are so weak that they're kind of not really a viable candidate. The Egyptians, we have in Egyptian records that they are coming back from a battle during this time period. So some people thought it was the Egyptians that stopped off at Hatzor and burned it to the ground. But the Egyptians, in their telling of the battle they fought and the way they're going home, they would not have passed by this way. Other people have said it was the Philistines who destroyed Hatzor, but the Philistines are what's called the sea peoples, or people of the sea. And Hatzor is way too far away from the coast to make this any kind of strategic location for the Philistines to conquer. In fact, nobody's found a single potsherd, like pottery, that's Philistine in the area. So it couldn't have been them. Other people have said it's other Canaanite city-states in the area. But at this point, if Hatzor, some people think Hatzor was like on the decline even at that time. But if it's on the decline and it's the head of all the other kingdoms in these city-states, it's not likely another city-state would have conquered them. Other people have said it was an internal job. It was other Hatzorites. I don't actually know if that's what they're called. That's the name I made up, Hatzorites. But people within the city destroyed the city itself. But we know that there were buildings that, were still standing after, like houses and stuff, and nobody lived in them. So it's like, if you're in your own city and you destroy it, would you not just remain in the city? Why would you leave town at that point and not keep the city for yourself? So all these other candidates that have been proposed don't really make a whole lot of sense. The only one that makes much sense, I shouldn't have gone there yet, is the sixth one, the Israelites. And number one, they're the only people that have a story of the destruction of Hatzor. So we stopped to talk about that, about the idea of, is the Bible right? Is the Bible right about this? Because if we can't trust the Bible being right about this, how can we trust the Bible being right about, not just in general, but specifically to the Joshua story? So when we go to Hatzor, we sit here in the Canaanite palace, and we talk about the idea of which Yeshua do we follow. What that means is the name Joshua and the name Jesus are essentially the same name. This is going to be a bad analogy, but it's kind of like if my name, you spelled it with two T's versus one T or something like that. Like, it's essentially the same name. Yeshua Joshua, Yeshua Jesus. And what we ask ourselves at Hatzor is, which one are we supposed to follow? Because we have Yeshua Joshua, who completely annihilates people groups, cities, men, women, children. And then we have Jesus in the New Testament, who is talking about turning the other cheek and walking the extra mile. So it's like, which Yeshua do we follow? Yeshua Joshua, Yeshua Jesus? And it's not even that simple, because we have Yeshua Joshua, who makes peace treaties and keeps peace with foreign people groups. Then we have a picture of Yeshua Jesus in Revelation that's very violent. So we go to Hatzor and we sit there. If you've gone to Israel with me, we've sat here and asked ourselves this tough question. The one that probably a lot of you are asking yourself as we go throughout the story tonight, about what do we make of what Joshua is doing? What do we make of what God is commanding Joshua to do here? Yeah. Who would have profited what? Who would have profited by destroying a whole people? Well, essentially it's the Israelites that are profiting. Profiting only in the sense of benefiting, not profiting like, I guess sort of economically with the plunder they took, but a lot of that is really meant to not just be devoted to the sanctuary of the Lord, but meant to establish them as a people. So even the economic benefits or profiting is a benefit towards the survival of them as a people group. Does it affect us politically today? That's a good question. Hold on to that, because we're going to come back to it in a minute and talk about what it means for us today. But yeah, part of when you ask about who's a profit and benefit, when you lay siege to a city, meaning you surround a city you're basically choking them out. You surround a city so that no food can get in, maybe no water can get into the city because maybe they draw their water from an outside well or an outside spring. So if you're cutting off their food and water source, eventually they just have to give up. Now, by the time they do, what has happened inside the city is pretty non-hygienic. So it's basically, there is disease, there is rampant, illnesses and disease and stuff happening in the city. So to destroy that people group, that once they surrender, to destroy those people is almost a hygienic health thing to do. So when you ask about who's benefiting, an army that's surrounded and laid siege to a city, and then you destroy those people that are inside, could be a hygiene thing, a health thing, because you're getting rid of all the disease that is essentially accumulated in the city and among this people group when you've laid siege to them. So I guess that's who would benefit. In the instances here under Joshua's leadership, we are meant to understand that it's the Israelites who are benefiting because they're essentially taking over this land for their own people. They're going to divide it up among the 12 tribes. So here, Joshua took this entire land. Joshua waged war against all these kings for a long time so that he may destroy them totally, exterminating them without mercy. So Joshua took the entire land just as the Lord had directed Moses, and he gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal divisions. Then the land had rest from war. So we see this going back to the book of Deuteronomy. Here's an example of that Awkward Moments Children's Bible I was telling you guys about, I think, a couple weeks ago. There's actually 3 versions of it now, so if you look on Amazon, you can buy these if you want. But they essentially take strange, odd, sometimes difficult stories from the Bible, and again, it's written by somebody who is not trying to make fun of the Bible, but recognize that there are passages to wrestle with, and tries to present it in a funny way, although sometimes that goes right up to the line here. Obviously, you've got somebody in a scope of a sniper rifle here in this, and it's the passage from Deuteronomy about putting people to death, the commands that Moses gives to the Israelite people, that from the book of Deuteronomy, he is talking about, you're going to go into the promised land and wipe out these people groups. And so we see that now happening under the leadership of Joshua. So in Deuteronomy chapter 7, Moses instructs the Israelites, when Yahweh your God clears away many nations before you, you must utterly destroy them. Well, in modern terms, we would call that genocide. So for us, the question is, how are we supposed to understand? How are we as readers of the Bible, listeners of this story, to understand the ethics behind total annihilation, total destruction, including, every woman, man, child? How can we comprehend a God who does such things? So we have this term here, Canaanite genocide. Again, the Hebrew word there is harem. Sometimes that is translated as something like the ban. Sometimes in English we translate it as something like destruction or destroy. But that's what we're talking about here. This complete kind of utter destruction that is commanded by Moses and then takes place under the leadership of Joshua here. So obviously in this cartoon, they're saying, complete destruction? And then the guy asking the question, what about the 6th commandment, which is thou shalt not kill? So he's kind of asking the question probably a lot of us would ask. So here's kind of 4 proposals, though, about what to make of this. Like, what to make of this Canaanite genocide, this destruction, this annihilation of these people groups. The first one is simply God's not good. That's one way to look at this. Well, God's not a good God. It's interesting, like people have been asking these questions. We're not going to solve it tonight because people were asking these questions for thousands of years. So I don't think we're going to solve it tonight. Many books have been written about it. They've got names like, I know there's one, the verse we just read a minute ago about exterminating them without mercy. There's a book called Show Them No Mercy. And it's kind of a debate of the different ideas on what to do about these stories that we read in the Bible. There's one called Disturbing Divine Behavior, because when we look at these stories, sometimes we think this is disturbing divine behavior. This is disturbing behavior coming from God. Another one is called, Is God a Moral Monster? We look at the morality of what's happening here, and the question that this author poses is God a moral monster? So one of the ways to look at this is, well, God's not a good God. Now, that goes against everything else that we read in the Bible, essentially. And I'm not talking about just the New Testament. I'm not talking about an Old Testament God versus a New Testament God. So it's not just the God under the revelation of Christ, Jesus Christ, that we read about in the New Testament, that we look at this and say, no, we know that God is a good God. It's the God of the Old Testament too, the God that tells his people what he expects of them, unlike all the other gods and goddesses. He tells them what he expects of them. And tells them how to be in right relationship with him. The God is a good God. So we look at this, and one way to look at this is, well, God's not good. But we look at I put good's not good, huh? Good's not good is not good. That doesn't even make any sense. God is not good is what that's supposed to say. But we see from the rest of the stories, the rest of the Bible, when we look at it as a whole, that God is a good God. So another way to look at it, well, the Bible is not accurate. That we don't have an accurate accounting of what is happening here. That it's just all made up, or it's not accurate. Now, there is an aspect of this story that there can be hyperbole that's involved in the telling of these stories. So think back at the story we looked at earlier with, talking about 12,000 people of Ai were killed. But earlier it said 36 Israelites were killed, and it talked about them being routed. They were routed, 36 of 3,000. It's like, that's just over 1% of your fighting force. And it's probably 0.1% of your entire fighting force that's coming from Jericho and the region of Jericho. So the words that are used there are something like division. So oftentimes throughout the Old Testament we see this. When it says 50,000 people, what it says in Hebrew is something like 5 divisions. Now, division is often 10,000 people, which is why they say then 50,000 people. But sometimes a division can be 10 people. Sometimes a division can be 1,000 people. Sometimes a division can be 100 people. So we don't always know what to make with the numbers that are used. There's not really a great way for us to understand the numbers being used. So there's some sort of hyperbole that could be involved in the sense of what it's saying about the numbers of the people that are being destroyed in these cities and these people groups. Yeah, well. So for those of you who didn't hear, that Rob was talking about the judgment that's being brought, and the form of the judgment is being brought about by Joshua and the army of God here. And certainly there's some aspect to that where, we have instances of the Canaanite people, the Amorite people, the people that are living in this region that are doing things like, we have many examples of them committing child sacrifice. And so there's this aspect of they're committing this horrific act, and that's part of their sin, and the judgment is coming upon them. The natural question in response to that is, how is killing children a fitting, correction of killing children? But there's something, I don't want to get too far off on this tangent, but there's a difference between distributive justice and retributive justice. Meaning retributive justice is like a punishment for an act. You do something wrong, and the retributive justice, like in our judicial system. The idea is that there is a fair punishment for your crime. It's retributive. Then there's distributive justice, something that God does. It's not some crime that's been committed, but God distributes justice to people because he is a good God. That's partly why we reject that first proposal that God is not good. Because we see that God is a good God. He distributes justice to those who may not deserve it or who have no capacity to get it. And so there's the question of what is this judgment that's happening here? Is it retributive because of a sin of the Canaanites? Or is God distributing justice to humanity in general through, like you said, through Joshua and the army of God? But again, back to the idea of hyperbole here, that there's an aspect of this. Think about, last Sunday I was watching golf, and they were showing a long drive competition where these guys, these big muscular dudes and women, they're not playing a round of golf. All they do is drive it to see how far they can hit the golf ball. For those of you who don't know golf, like a professional golfer probably drives the ball like 300 yards or something like that. Weekend duffers and stuff like that. If that's you're probably 250, something like that. I used to play a lot of golf. I haven't played golf in a long time, but that's probably where I was, somewhere in that range, not above 300. These long drive people are hitting 400 yards and stuff like that. But let's say you and we play golf a lot, and one time I come back to you and I see you and say, I played around the other day. I hit the best drive of my life. It went 400 yards. You'd be like, I don't know about that. That seems far for you. I've seen you play. I don't think you'd hit it that far. But it's just close enough to where I could hit it that it's kind of like, are you exaggerating, like a little bit there? But let's say I came to you and said, I had the best drive of my life. I hit it like 4,000 yards. You'd be like, okay, I know that he's just exaggerating for the sake of the story. He's exaggerating, and it's an understood and acknowledged exaggeration. I hate using the word exaggeration here because for us in English, that sounds like a lie. Exaggeration is a lie. So I'm trying to make the distinction that there's an understood exaggeration, an understood hyperbole if I said I hit a golf ball 4,000 yards. Because if you said, did you really hit a golf ball 4,000 yards? I'm like, no, I didn't hit a golf ball over 2 miles. I didn't do that. I'm acknowledging that I'm using hyperbole. I'm acknowledging that I'm exaggerating. So there's an aspect to the story here that's a possibility that there is an understood, acknowledged hyperbole exaggeration that the author is using. That's hard for us to hear and understand because, again, we think of that as lying, that not being accurate. That's not how the Old Testament authors would have thought of it. But we don't. But despite that, the idea of hyperbole, we take the Bible to be true and accurate. So to look at these stories as, well, the Bible's just not accurate, it's just made up, or they got it all wrong, is not a good solution. So another way to look at it is, well, what the Bible describes is not genocide. We look at these stories like that's genocide. You're wiping out a people group. You're wiping out the, entire cities of people. That's genocide. And one way that people look at this is that, well, it's not genocide because if God is doing it, then it's not genocide. I understand what some people are saying when they talk about that or look at it that way, but that's really not being very honest with the biblical text. When we look at the biblical text, because you're looking at these stories, you are hearing these stories and thinking, this is annihilation, obliteration. Why is God doing this? What are we to make of these stories under Joshua's leadership that's happening here? Because when you look at it, you recognize it as something like genocide. So to say, well, it's not genocide because God's doing it, so it's not genocide, is really not being very faithful or honest with the text we have in the Bible here, the stories that we have. Another way is to look at that is that genocide is justified. This is similar to the last one, that since it's God doing it, then it's okay. And that, I think for most of us, that presents many more problems than it probably solves there. That to look at this and think that God is to be associated directly with genocide and the wiping out of these people groups and the way that we look at it and understand it from these stories. What I can offer you is this. There seems to be something extremely distinct about what is happening in these stories. Yeah. I think we need the mic.
When God called Abraham and he told me that he will be a father for all nations, without accepting, in all nations, Abraham will be a father for all nations. So here we can see that the same God who is telling Joshua to kill the Canaanites without mercy. And we know that God, by his nature, is a God of mercy, love, and care. So if you cannot call it a genocide, I don't know which name are we going to call it so that we can, so that God can be, because that's the one is making because if all nations are important before God, why to kill other nations? Because they are children also, they are innocent. Those who are not seen, they are innocent people, the children and all of them. But the Bible says without mercy, and God is God of mercy. Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. And I think what you're hitting on is the idea that I was mentioning there, that it's not to not call it that, it seems not faithful or honest with the biblical text, but to also to just say, well, it's okay because God was doing it, is really equating God with genocide or lumping God in with this idea that genocide is okay. The way that we can distinguish that, and this gets back to your point about, what do we do with it today politically, is if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 20, Moses contrasts the total destruction of the Canaanites that he is saying is going to be necessary, is going to happen, with compassionate, merciful rules in dealing with other nations and other people groups. The reason that's important is because he sets apart some sort of new ethics of war. This is where, even to this day, when we talk about the just war theory, if you've taken philosophy in college or something like that, or just read on your own, you've probably come across that term before, the just war theory. When is war just? When is war okay to take part in, either theologically under the God you worship or as humanity? When is war okay? When is war just? A lot of what we derive in just war theory to this day comes from originally from Moses. What Moses talks about in these distinctions between what is going to happen with the Canaanites and what is going to happen with other people groups. Because even Moses talks about how peace will be offered to people. Throughout the story of Joshua, we see that many times, and we already saw with the Gibeonites tonight, he makes peace with people. He makes peace with these other people groups. When we get to the beginning of Judges, it's clear that the entire people of the land of Canaan, the entire people of the Promised Land, have not been wiped out because they're still living amongst them. So Moses seems to make a great distinction between what's happening with the Canaanites and what is happening with the other people groups. The reason that should matter for us is because what is happening in the story of Joshua is to be understood as distinctly different than anything that should happen ever again. It's not to be repeated. And so I've got this cartoon up here that, won't that set a bad precedent? Because that's an obvious question. If genocide was okay then, isn't genocide okay now? And not just okay because we think, oh, isn't that okay now? Because we think of it in terms of our enemies. But if genocide is okay, why shouldn't God wipe out all of America tomorrow? Would that be okay? Everybody that lives in America is wiped out? Is that genocide okay? But from the way that Moses offers these distinctions between offering mercy and what's done under the harem, the ban, the destruction of the Canaanites is not to be repeated. It's not something that we should fear today. And if we see it today, we know that it's wrong because of what Moses had offered us in the book of Deuteronomy. He says this is coming, but this is only for a time. This is only for the taking of the promised land. This is only for this particular moment in time, these instances, and it's not to be repeated. You're to make peace. And it goes back to, I think one of you brought up, or maybe it was you, with the covenant to Abraham. You will be a blessing to all nations. How can they be a blessing to all nations if this idea of destruction and annihilation is meant to continue? But Moses says, no, this is coming for a time. I know that doesn't solve the problem in your mind. And like I said, people have been asking this for thousands of years, so we're not going to simply solve it tonight. But again, it's to be understood in a certain time and certain context, and we should have, I guess, comfort in knowing that that's not something that's supposed to happen again, and be able to recognize it as such. What's that? Yeah, it's happening, but yes. Well, yes, I think that your instance would be a little closer to some of the stories in Joshua's, certainly, versus the idea of genocide more widely that we see in some parts of the world. But you're right, it is happening, and that's why I say we should be able to recognize it as such, and that it is not something that should be happening. It's not something we have to sit today and think, well, maybe it's from God over there, that's happening. The rest of the book of Joshua, we'll just look real quick here. They're just going to break us down. You can kind of see in these chapters, it just lists the defeated kings. It says there's still land to be taken. They're going to divide up the land, the promised land. There's going to be an allotment for Caleb. And then at the very bottom there, then the land had rest from war. Take note of that, because that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the book of Judges, this idea of a time of peace. Again, allotments for Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh. They divide up the rest of the land among the 12 tribes. The Levites, who don't have their own land, they say, well, what about us? And Joshua makes provisions for them. The eastern tribes, who they got their land first because they were east of the Jordan River, but Joshua basically told them, hey, you can't just camp out here now. You got to help the rest of the group get their own land and allotment. So the eastern tribes fight with the Israelites throughout and then return home. Here's kind of you've probably got a map in the back of your Bible that looks something like this. Just shows kind of the division of the lands. This one's a little more simple to probably see. Joshua's farewell to the leaders. He says, you yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. So Joshua's at the end of his life here. This is his farewell address. He knows he's going to be gone soon. His leadership is going to be gone. The tribes are now divided out amongst their own land, so they're not going to be united under one leader. He's worried about them and giving them one last admonition, one last warning. Stick to what the Lord has commanded. Don't go off and start worshiping these other gods and goddesses. Of course, we know that they're going to harlot themselves to those gods and goddesses. It's not going to work. But Joshua is concerned for them at this point. If you violate the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and go and serve those other gods, bow down to them, the Lord's anger will burn against you. Let's end with the verse that probably many of you know. Then you crossed the Jordan and came to Jericho, and I gave them into your hands. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshiped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So probably many of you have something like this in your house, or have seen other people with, something like this in their house as a reminder for themselves and their family. I'll end with this. What's unique about this idea, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. This is different than what has previously been offered, because before it was always God that did the choosing. God elected the Israelites to be his people. God chose them. But now Joshua is stepping back and says, it's time for you to choose. It's time for you to choose who you're going to serve. You've been in Egypt, our ancestors have been in Egypt for hundreds of years and worshiped Egyptian gods. You started worshiping foreign gods on east of the Jordan River. You've started worshiping foreign gods now here in the Promised Land. But it's time to step back and finally choose who you're going to serve ultimately. And this is different than the people that they are around. The people that they are around had no choice. There was no choice for them to make, because their only choice was, who am I going to worship today? Which god or goddess am I going to worship today? So the Israelites are different from all the people in the land of Canaan, all the people in the Promised Land, because Joshua is saying, now it's time for you to choose. It's time for you to make the choice for your family and for your tribe and for you as a people of Israel. Let's see. So they of course, say, oh yeah, we're going to do that. We're going to do it for sure. And Joshua reminds them again, if you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, he'll turn and bring disaster on you. Joshua reminds them again to throw away these foreign gods that are among you, yield their hearts to the Lord. And that day Joshua made a covenant for the people, and there at Shechem, there he is returned once again to Shechem, where Abraham and Jacob had been, and where he had reaffirmed the covenant in chapter 8, and reaffirmed with them the decrees and laws. And then he dies at the ripe old age of 110 here. So we didn't quite get into the book of Judges tonight. We'll start there next week. We'll start with some very odd stories of a couple of guys. And as I mentioned before, the book of Judges, we think of judges as judicial, in a courtroom. Judges, that word in the Bible, is a redeemer, a rescuer, a savior, something like that God is going to send to bring the people out of their oppression. And so naturally, many of those judges, those rescuers, are very godly men and women, and there's a few jerks and idiots as well that I've mentioned before. So we'll start with some of them next week, including a very odd story of a left-handed man and a very rotund king. And then we'll get into the stories of Deborah and Jael and Gideon. And then the week after that, we'll get into Samson and some of the other judges. There's 6 major judges, 6 minor judges. Sometimes the minor judges only have 1 sentence in the Bible, so their stories will be brief. But others will really dig into, like Deborah and Jael and Gideon and Samson, and some of the other ones like Jephthah and the Levite and his concubine, before we end our series in week 6 with the book of Ruth. So hope to see you next week as we get into the book of Judges. Where's the land of milk and honey? It is the promised land. So the land of Canaan, the land that they've come into here, is the land flowing with milk and honey. Honey is not bees' honey, really, like we think of it. Bee honey in that instance is like from a fig, like that sticky from a fig date. So it represents 2 different things, but it is the promised land is what is described as the land flowing with milk and honey. If you got any other questions or comments, feel free to stick around. We're a few minutes over, so I'll let you go, but I'll stick around if you got questions or comments. Hope to see you next week.